Jewel, you do amazing things. Your bio's out there pretty much everywhere, Forbes to you name it. So I don't want to read through your bio to introduce you. I really would love to learn a little bit more about your backstory. And what I really appreciate is your transparency. In fact, right before me as I'm kind of doing my notes is literally the article you penned yourself last week, and which was really powerful and I think and helpful for people to understand kind of the behind the scenes and the things that you experience day in and day out. So what really struck me from that was how formative I at least believe your growing up years to be, and the influence of your grandparents to your mom to your dad, watching them, even the picture you share on your Medium post of you going to work with your mom. It just is very poignant of like just what you experienced and what you had as a young person to model. And so I'm curious for you to kind of peel back a little bit even further, like how early was it for you when you realized you wanted to be in business and the power of business? Was that from that experience? Was that something that was shaped over time? Was that something that, how did that come to be for you?
Yeah, so I've been very reflective lately and have been thinking a lot about childhood and kind of what were those early points where I thought, okay, I can do this, or I want to be in business. And I keep going back to this memory of when I was growing up. I talked about my grandfather in the piece that I wrote, and I remember going into the bank with him, and I remember the respect. It was kind of like the world stopped when he entered the room and everyone said, "Hello, Mr. Burks. How are you, Mr. Burks? I hope you're having a great day." And his presence sort of shifted every room that he went into. And I remember thinking, man, that's power right there. That's pretty cool. And I think that was kind of the earliest memory I have of thinking, okay, I wanted to be like my grandfather. And I knew that he was a business owner. And I knew that from an early age. And I knew it meant something around having buildings and having money. That was the thing. I knew that because my job early, I can remember back to probably when I was 5 or 6 years old and going to Mobile during the summer. I was always given the stack of ones to count and make the recording for the bank. Record how many ones we had and give that to my grandmother and my grandfather to put together the report for the day. And I thought that was, first of all, that was a cool job for me as a young person to have that responsibility of counting and making sure it was correct. And then just, again, that kind of respect that he had going into the bank or anywhere that I would go with him. I noticed that people would take notice of when he entered the room. And I thought that was awesome from an early age. And so I think, yeah, back probably 5 or 6 years old is when I thought, okay, I want to do what he does one day. And then that was reaffirmed growing up and watching my mom in business and watching my dad take on the businesses that my grandfather started. So yeah, I always tell people I got it honest. I probably never considered too many other careers, but to be an entrepreneur. But yeah, those early memories were very much formative and very much influential to everything I'm doing today.
That's awesome. Well, it's neat because I think, I think sometimes one of the things I've been reflective of in COVID is when everybody's forced to work from home. And so now on the Zoom calls or Google Hangouts or whatever, the kids pop in, or whatever, just life is happening. And I think, for so long, business and family, business and life have been so disconnected from one another. That our children sometimes grow up and don't even know what mommy or daddy does when they go off to work. Mm-hmm. And then we expect to kind of release our children into the world. And it's just been refreshing, I think, to see people try to think through what the intertwining of those two looks like. But then I think to hear the intentionality of your grandfather and then your parents to weave that into your upbringing, to give you a picture of what could be, what it's like for them. And so how do we as parents, and I'd be curious, I don't think you have any children yet, but as you think about, your family down the road, what does that look like for you and for your husband to kind of like help your children have a picture of what could be? And so that's one of the things I've been thinking about. I don't know if that's think something you think about, but I have 4 daughters, and I'm always trying, like, how do I help them, get a picture of what this looks like, and the good and the bad, and the
Yeah.
mundane and the exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's so, it's so interesting, and it's generous of you. I don't know that my parents were, maybe they were, but my parents had me pretty young. So I don't know how intentional they were. I think it was more a function of a need for them to bring me along on, my mom was always in the office, and my parents divorced when I was very young. And so for the most part, it was me and my mom. And so she didn't have a babysitter oftentimes. And so I had to kind of tag along with her to go to the office, and same thing when I was spending summers with my dad, that was our time together. So he was working, so I was working. That was kind of how it was. But I do think that was so valuable for me. And sometimes I feel a little bad because I have younger brothers, and by the time they were born, my parents had transitioned a little bit. So my dad, by the time my younger brothers were born, he had transitioned from the businesses my grandfather started. Most of them, unfortunately, he wasn't able to hold on to. And so he transitioned to nonprofit work. So my dad's been a director of a Boys and Girls Club in Mobile for the last 10 years or so. And before that was a director of a YMCA. And so has been mostly working with children and in these capacities with nonprofits for the majority of my younger brother's lives. So they actually never have seen him in the same way that I saw him kind of working day and night we had convenience stores and laundromats and those types of businesses. So they didn't get the benefit of that. They've seen him work obviously really hard in the capacities that he's worked, but it's a little bit different.
Sure.
And then my younger brother with my mom's businesses started doing well by the time my brother was born. So his upbringing and, the way that my mom was working when I was growing up is very different than how she's working now. So my younger brothers, I would say, are a little bit more spoiled than I was growing up, or at least that's how it seems to me.
That's awesome.
But
I won't send them a link to this podcast.
They might see it anyway. But I think about how different, and that happens when there's a big age gap between kids. I think, the first children have a certain upbringing, and then the latter have a little bit different. But I do think a lot about making sure that they have the benefit of some of the things that I think have been really beneficial to me, as far as what my parents instilled in me, just by me seeing the work that they were doing and how hard it was for them. And so, I think that's something that I think about, not yet because I don't have kids, but I think about it for my younger siblings, making sure that they understand, the value of hard work and how everything is not going to come easy for them. And so that's really important to me as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think that's a really helpful perspective. Because I do think as a parent, you want the best for your kids. You don't want them to see the struggle. You want them to, their world's good, but I think sometimes in doing that, we forget that them seeing the pain, or as you were describing even in your piece, your mother weeping at times over her own business and the journey. It's tough. The rawness of that is formative. But much like your grandfather, I think bringing our children into that experience, I remember some of my earliest memories are similar to you and your grandfather. My dad was a military officer, and going on post and seeing soldiers salute him, gave me a sense of pride in kind of what he did, and who I didn't understand what he did, but it was like, this is something special. And really helpful for me in kind of thinking through my own future. There was one quote in your piece that I wanted to read real quick and just kind of talk a little bit about. You said, my biggest takeaway from watching the entrepreneurial journeys of both my parents was that in order to achieve any level of success, I would have to work harder and sacrifice more than most. I learned that there would be many things I cannot control in life and business, but the one thing I can always control is what I put into achieving any goal. And I thought that was powerful, to say the least. But I wanted to talk to you too a little bit about, so you've built a startup. You now have done venture investing, and even I think in here you acknowledge kind of the life-altering financial situation that you find yourself in because of the fortunate sale to Amazon. But still, in your young 30s, you have this drive and this passion and this energy to do more. Where does that drive come from? What is your why? What's this purpose that drives you to continue to push forward with these things?
Yeah. I still see problems. I see big problems that need to be solved. And I think I've been super blessed and in my life in ways that I cannot even imagine or could not have even imagined. And I think that because of those blessings, I have to continue to work to make sure that other people are in positions that they may have not thought that they could ever be in. And so I think my journey is so unique, and I've gathered so many things along the way. And I think it's important for me to not hold those things and not hold those blessings, but really focus on how can I make sure that other people are blessed in various ways. And so that's really the motivation is, I don't ever assign anything that has happened to me to just me. I think it's all been a function of, my faith and in my case, I'm a believer. So God has blessed me in many ways. And then, my family history and the fact that I was born into this family where I could literally watch entrepreneurs day and night and see their journeys. And so all of these things kind of put together, to me means that I have these unique insights and talents and gifts that I have to share. And so that means that I have to keep working,
Yeah.
at least for the time being. And I'm in these positions that are very, they don't even feel, it's definitely hard work to raise a fund and to lead a team at Google now with Google for Startups. But the work is so rewarding when I'm able to see what happens when we invest in a company that maybe has this great product but didn't have enough money to really push it forward and scale. Or, I'm meeting founders that have these ideas that are really, really strong ideas, but they just don't know the next step and the next step. And so I'm in fortunate positions to be able to help folks through the early stages of their business. And I think that is just the best thing ever. I'm really happy to be doing the work that I'm doing.
Yeah, it seems like it. There's a definite energy. It's kind of like the quote, like blessed to be a blessing. So it seems like
Yes.
you look at the things that you've attained in life and recognize, there's a little bit of Jewel in there, of course, right? You can't discount the messenger, so to speak, or the vessel or the tool, but you've been afforded these things for the benefit of others. And so how do you use that to solve some of these problems as you mentioned, which is awesome. Which kind of gets me into kind of the next section around Collab, which is one of the projects you're working on. And I say one because you wear many hats and you do it so well. Collab, so talk to us a little bit about that for those that don't understand what Collab is. What is Collab, and what are you hoping to achieve with that company?
Yes. So I am one of the managing partners at Collab Capital. And we are focused on a big vision, which has to do with disrupting the wealth gap in this country. We believe that one of the ways, it's not the singular way, but one of the ways to disrupt the wealth gap is through investment and growth of Black-owned businesses. And so we're really intent on investing in Black-founded, Black-owned companies with the idea that these investments should be really targeted and fit to the companies that we're investing in. So we look at it a little different than traditional venture. We think about how do we really optimize for founder ownership and optionality. And what that means to us is how do we help them build a business in a way that works for them as the founders and for the business itself. So we don't necessarily think that it's appropriate for all businesses to raise, millions and millions of dollars and therefore give up a lot of equity in the business, because sometimes, and in the case of my family, it's really important to be able to build a great business and pass it on in the generations. And venture doesn't necessarily allow for that, just given the time horizons and the expectations of investors. And so we think that if we are actually going to disrupt the wealth gap in this country, then we have to be thinking differently about how we actually capitalize businesses that are owned by Black founders.
And I think it's helpful And I appreciate the way you described that, because I think some of the discussion that I've heard, from the Kaufman Access to Capital Lab or Zebras United, it's on one side this idea that the structure of capital itself needs to shift, right? That venture only serves 1%. Only 1% of companies ever take venture. 83% of founders take some form of non-traditional financing. That it's extractive, but then there is acknowledgement that it does work for some types of businesses. Your tech-oriented, higher growth type companies, typically that have maybe an expensive pathway to the market, that need that capital. But it's not really by and large the best capital for most companies. But I am curious, as it relates to Black founders, how much of it is the structure of capital is inhibitive, and then how much of it is the decision bias or the fund managers themselves? Because I think sometimes, like when we just relegate it to capital structures, at least from my perspective, we're assuming that Black founders aren't building tech-oriented companies that could take venture, right? That they aren't able to grow venture-backable businesses. So talk to me about, because I kind of see it as a little bit of both, and how do you see that? What does that look like for Collab and the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, it's both. It's definitely both. And I'm a living testament for it being both. I think the business that I built with PartPick was definitely a venture backable business. But we were not able to access the right amount of funding for the business. And so I actually lived it, where I believe that I was my reality was that I experienced bias in fundraising. I met investors who did not invest in my business because I was a Black woman, and they cannot understand how I would be successful in the particular business that I was in. So that is a fact. It's verified. I've had conversations with people who did not invest in my business, and when they were honest with themselves, they were able to say, I did not think that you would be successful with this particular business. And that is the reason that I did not invest. Not because I didn't think the technology was great, not because I didn't think that there was a huge problem that needed to be solved. It was because I didn't believe that you would be able to sell into this industry, or, name the reason. And so it's absolutely true. There is bias in decision-making that leads to fewer Black founders who even have venture backable companies. That, all things aside, if you put a white founder in the place of a Black founder, this company would be able to raise capital. That absolutely is the case. And there needs to be more options available for really all founders. I think when we talk about alternative capital, there is a need for there to be structures that are looking a little bit different, for the fact that you have this wide open space where folks are not being well served by venture, not being well served by banks, and there's just opportunity in that space. I think our perspective is that it's particularly important to offer Black founders some alternatives. Now there's an urgency around it because there's such a huge gap as you talk about Black founders and access to capital, mostly because of lack of access to venture, and the fact that it's lack of access to bank loans as well, because there's been historical discrimination on that side. So there's already a gap. You have now a gap on the side of accessing what we call traditional, funding sources. And so it's a really, really huge gap. So we think there's a market opportunity there, which is why we focus on an alternative solution, particularly for Black founders. But my perspective is that there should be more Black founders who are building venture backable companies and can access traditional venture capital as well. So it's both things.
Yeah. And I think I'm so glad to hear you say that with such passion too, which is great, because it's true. Because I do think sometimes we kind of put these as either or conversations, and so and we're fickle as people, and so the next fancy thing is this alternatives to equity, which I think is important, and we need to fill these gaps, but we can't ignore the value of venture that works for some businesses, and the bias that exists that still needs to be fixed for every citizen, every person that wants to build a business to access that capital. And so I think we need to work there. We need to build better systems. We need to work to hold our banks accountable, as you mentioned, because traditional finance is there. It's a part of the capital stack, and we can't ignore it. And how do we hold them accountable to lend more and lend more, like your grandfather experience? Like what happened to those days where your grandfather could walk into the bank, they knew his name, they knew who he was, and that was enough that was enough.
I mean, one thing to note there is that it was a Black bank that he was walking into. Yeah. So I don't think that he would have been able, I know that he would not have been able to get a loan had it not been a Black bank, but that's another discussion topic of what's happened to the Black banks in this country. Many of them are, not doing very well as far as the number of assets under management. And, we've seen many of them close over the last several years. It's something that I think as we are now, most of the people in the country are now waking up to a lot of realities. I feel more people are understanding like, oh, okay, there are still, Black banks in major cities. We have a few, actually one here in Atlanta and, places, other banks in other parts of the country. But that's another thing that my grandfather would not have been able to get a loan from if there were not Commonwealth Bank in Mobile, Alabama, that was able to lend to him as a Black man. So that's another thing to talk about. We can go on and on about that, but yeah.
Well, even in that, it's a sad thing that I knew he walked into a Black bank and you didn't have to say that. That's a sad reality, because I think my previous conversation with Maurice Jones around CDFIs and when he was in the Clinton White House and helped build that in the early 90s, and just kind of what's still not been developed there and how that's still not yet a part of the mainstream banking vernacular. There needs to be work there, more investment in Black banks. I think too, there's the unintended consequences of things that are perceived as good. So like with the globalization of our economy and the hyper consolidation of banks, a lot of people look at that as an efficiency gain. I look at that as a negative on local communities, to the point, whether it's a Black bank, a white bank or whatever, being able to walk in and know your banker, and the decisions are not some algorithm, chunked through underwriting, and you're able to face-to-face talk to someone. We've kind of lost that in the traditional finance space. So I'm hoping we can.
Yeah, we saw I think the best recent kind of example of that is what happened with PPP, that first round where the loans were given out to people who had a relationship with their banker or who could call, they had a big enough account to be able to navigate that quickly. And the folks who maybe did not have that relationship or didn't have a big enough account were completely left out of that first round. And so, that local credit union and, the local banker and having that relationship, I think is something that, to your point, is very important, particularly for business owners, but it's been lost with a lot of the consolidation that we've seen.
Yeah, and you kind of speak to the other part that you wrote in your piece last week, which is just the cost of administration and the cost of management, the cost of delivering, and when you step back and you think, okay, how did someone conceive of this? You can understand. It's like, okay, PPP, that's a lot of money. We got to move quickly because America's hurting. And how can we do this quickly and efficiently? Well, banks, they're already, so it makes sense on the surface, but when you actually start to peel that back and you're like, okay, well, banks are a business, and of course they're going to prioritize their existing customers. Of course they're going to prioritize their largest customers. So then who gets left off the list? People that are small dollar businesses, they're, the ones that get called in week 3, week 4, week 5, and businesses that they don't have a relationship with. And so I think we've got to think through those unintended consequences. Even in the non-emergency scenarios, like I'm sure the same in Georgia, we've got investment capital available to startups through the state economic development. But a lot of the ways they deploy that are through traditional funds managed by traditional white guys like myself that look a lot like me, or banks. And so again, where does that funding go? And we have to start
Yeah,
asking ourselves those questions and start to think about that. So it's great to,
definitely.
I love the focus of Collab, because I think your orientation around the problem and the problem, and that's, I was curious why not traditional venture, and it's great to know, Brian Brackeen and those folks up in Cincinnati building a fund. But I think your problem you're trying to solve is wealth building, and that wealth
Yeah.
building ultimately comes through ownership. And so we're going to build wealth for generations among the Black community. How do we maximize wealth? Well, if we give up equity, how is that maximizing wealth? We might, and so I love that. Can you explain for folks though the profit sharing model? What does that look like? And then I think the second question I have on that is, how does that look to other funders, investors? Do they get kind of weirded out by that? Is it kind of wonky for them? There's always that kind of rolled eye look sometimes with different term orientations. So.
Yes. So I'll answer the second question first. I do think that people instantly, when you ask them to consider new things, they're already like, I don't really want to do that work. But the more that we have had conversations and are able to walk people through the model and the why behind the model, the more people are like, we see the light bulb go off and eyes get brighter, and people see like, okay, this makes a lot of sense. And people be curious about, how do we get to this point? Why did we decide to do it this way? And then once they understand, they're like, okay, yeah, this is good. So it does take a little bit longer to get to that point with people. And some folks are like, actually, I'm new to all of this. So a lot of the conversations we've been having recently are people who are more, traditional LPs who are now thinking about investing in Black entrepreneurs and see what we're doing. And because we're so direct about the fact that we're investing in Black entrepreneurs, that is what sparked the conversation. But when they realize that we're doing it a little bit differently, then they're like, not sure. But it's been great to be able to walk people through kind of the steps of understanding versus it's new for folks to be thinking about just one people group, thinking about just investing in Black entrepreneurs. That's already a bar for folks to have to get over. And then thinking about the different model. So to say a little bit more about the model, we landed on profit sharing because we wanted to figure out what's a mechanism to better align the interests of the entrepreneur and the investor. And what we believe is that if we can help the entrepreneur get to profitability and then grow from there, then we should be able to kind of play in that upside of the profit. And again, we're thinking about businesses who maybe don't want to give up a lot of equity through the journey. And so really want to focus in on the fundamentals of the business. And so that is a specific entrepreneur. So it's not that we will invest in all Black founders, because again, some founders want to go the route of maybe not optimizing for profitability, not optimizing for ownership, but really pursuing the high growth and growth at all costs kind of path that venture sets you up on. But for us, we think that it works out and we can make it work so that we're sharing with the profit. So even for us, we're a little bit different than a lot of the other alternative capital funds that you'll see out there that may be based in revenue-based financing, kind of taking just straight off of revenue, very much predictable. We have a little bit more flexibility, I think, working with the entrepreneur to figure out when is the right point for us to begin sharing in the profits, based on the growth trajectory of the business model, things that we can kind of suss out from the first few conversations with the entrepreneur based on kind of where they are. And the key to it is that the profit share plays alongside the equity, and they basically have the chance to buy back their equity as they share that profit. So that's the lever, is you initially invest, you look just like an early stage investor, but as the business grows and becomes profitable, then the entrepreneur has the chance to get their equity back essentially, so that at the end of the day, they can ultimately, if we invest our first investment, if she shares back a certain level of profits, she can basically buy us all the way down to 1%. And that way we'll always have at least 1% in any business that we invest in the case that they do decide to sell one day, or they do decide to raise another round of capital after us. But ultimately, we're really focused on making sure that the entrepreneur owns the business and that we've been able to share in the growth of the company as they've become more profitable. So that's kind of how the model works.
That's great.
It's something that we've built over the last year and a half plus. Really gone through lots of iterations to make the math work out and the legalese work out. But we're really proud of what we've built, and we think that at some point it will become a model for other funds as well.
Yeah, I love it. And, I think in your article, you talk about just the difficulties of developing a fund. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, once you get over the hurdles that you face as a Black woman, raising a fund in middle America, even though you have the success of Part Pick and the exit and the Google for Startups on your resume, the legal costs, the fund structure, convincing people to invest, you talk about, the untested qualification oftentimes of, the track record and just the limiter that is on new fund managers. It's a tough road. And then the structure, like the 2 and 20, which is kind of for some weird reason gotten baked into the psyche on how funds are supposed to be. I'm curious, yeah. Are you still kind of in that 220? Because it's interesting. I've started to see a little flexibility with some of that. I've got some friends that do like a 15.5. There's one fund that I'm aware of in more of the crypto blockchain space that's even like a 19.1. And it's interesting just to kind of think about like, okay, if we were to actually, chuck this actually only 30-year history of how we think venture investing is, what would we conceive of, and how have you all settled out on the structure itself of the fund and fund deployment and such?
Yeah, so we've made a decision that because we were already shaking up quite a few things as far as the model itself and who we're investing in and why we're investing, we decided to keep a lot of the fund structure stuff pretty vanilla so that people, at least when they saw the PPM and they saw the docs, they'd be like, okay, this looks familiar, check, check, check. So we did decide to make that pretty standard. But, now that I've kind of put it out there to people about the fact that we are doing this, that part at least is standard, people are saying, well, why didn't you should have changed that part too? So we'll see what happens with Fund 2. But for this first one, we wanted to keep some things to make it so that people, so it looks familiar to people and that they weren't having to learn each and every part of it, because we really care about the founder piece of it. For us, it makes it obviously a little bit more challenging to have to invest early into the fund and, have to pretty much go for a while without salaries and bank on, what we'll eventually get in carry. But yeah, we wanted to keep it a little vanilla for for the purposes of actually being able to raise some money.